Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to be with you. I think this is going to be quite a conversation on national leadership. What does country leadership look like at a time like this? A difficult time, to be fair. With us is a wonderful panel. We have Mavuso, the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa, the voice of business in South Africa, but also a bigger voice than that. And also Dr. Petrus de Kock, the GM for research at Brand South Africa, and a political analyst of many, many years standing. So we're going to do quite a bit today, but I thought I'd start off with some questions to our panelists before we go to them. And I want to know, so how do you measure a national brand leadership in a public health emergency, in a global crisis? And then where do we sit in the world? Do we sit with your Ostrich Alliance? That's the term for Brazil, Turkmenistan, Nicaragua leaders who completely deny that there's a problem. And perhaps to that we add Madagascar with the COVID organics. It's quite a story at the weekend. Or do we sit amongst best practice in the world? Finland, Norway, New Zealand, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea. Where would you place us? How has South Africa done? So Busi, I'd give you the floor first to chat us through to take us through your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ferial, and thank you very much to Daily Maverick for inviting me. So I think on an international scale, South Africa fares fairly well, especially in terms of how we decided to deal with the health crisis that was before us. I think the decisiveness, the assertiveness, the urgency with which we approached the situation was very much commendable. I think you would remember that we actually decided to lock down the country when there was less than 100 people that were actually, infected. And I think when you look at countries like, China, Italy, and US, we definitely were way ahead of the curve in as far as that is concerned. And I'm actually reminded of the conversation that we actually had with the president a week before he locked down, yes, where you could actually see, and I think he was trying to get the sense of business, in terms of what path should we take as a country at this moment? What decisions should we be making? And if we make the decision of locking down the country, what are the ramifications of that going to be on the economy? Because we know that our economy is actually pretty weak and has been weak for quite some time, but you could see how heavily it was weighing on him. I remember he made a specific inference where he was saying that I would actually rather sit with a limping economy rather than have to sit with the guilt of a lot of deaths, in my heart, with the guilt of not having acted earlier, when I could have done so. I don't want to find myself where President, who's the US president again? Donald Trump is actually sitting at the moment where the people... Exactly, where the people were saying you could have done better. So I think from that perspective, you could see that it is a matter that we took seriously. So I think our response to the situation was definitely spot on. It was definitely ahead of the curve. And I think it has definitely impacted the slope of the curve. We talk about flattening the curve, and you would see that when you measure how the South African curve is doing versus how, other economies are doing, US, UK, and China in particular, you would see that our curve is definitely, our slope is definitely, in a good space. And I think thanks and credit to the government for the swift action. And I think when you look at the measures and the interventions that we have put in place in the form of the relief measures, the economic relief measures that the president announced of 500 billion, the numbers were saying that a lot of underdeveloped countries are actually putting about 1.1% of GDP towards the COVID-19. And a lot of countries in between are putting between 3.4%, yes, and a lot of developed economies, I think, are sitting around 4 or 5%. Yeah. And I think at that time we were having that discussion as business to say that if our response at the time, it was less than 1%, if our response is only 1%, are we actually going to be able to deal, sufficiently, with this that we are facing as a country? And I think when the government again, boldly responded, by putting in 500 billion, which was equivalent of 10% of our GDP. That actually, I think, set us apart. So from a health perspective, Ferial, I think we have done particularly well. I think we've actually been very responsive, and we've been very responsible as the government. I don't know if we are doing the same from the economic perspective, and I don't know if we should go there now, or it is something that we probably should, look at later, because probably maybe the economic perspective is where we are at the moment. It's how we are choosing to deal with the different levels, how we are choosing to phase in the economic activity, to ensure that the country goes back to full production capacity and to full economic activity. If I were to look at that, and again, it's a bit difficult to say how do we fare internationally, because a lot of countries, are still, exactly where we are at the moment, where they are just phasing in the economic activity. So we actually don't have a lot that we can refer to. We had a best practice that we could observe with the health response, but I think with the economic response, we actually don't have the same. But I guess irrespective of what the other countries are doing in as far as the economic response is concerned, Ferial, I would argue, that we could actually be doing better in terms of opening up the economic activity. Remember, South Africa was already in a dire economic situation when we entered the lockdown. When we entered this year, we were already in a very difficult situation economically. You would remember that we were sitting at 6.8 budget deficit. You'd remember that our unemployment was already at 30%, one of the highest in the world. Youth unemployment of 58%. You'd remember that SARS was already saying that we have missed our tax revenue targets for 5 years in a row. You'd remember that Moody's had already said to us, that we are worried about the interventions that you're putting in place to ensure that you remain an investment grade country. So we were in a worse off position than where we were in 2008 when we entered the global economic crisis, because our economy was much more stronger. We're definitely in a surplus position, and we could actually, that is why we actually didn't feel the global economic crisis the way other countries did, precisely because of what our positioning was from an economic standpoint. I would therefore expect that the same agency that was actually applied in dealing with the health crisis, the same decisiveness, the same assertiveness, would actually have to be applied at the moment. But unfortunately, we are not seeing that. We are seeing a lot of rigidity that has been applied in as far as opening up the economy. We are worried that, you have government at the moment who are actually saying that the economic modeling that has been done, is nothing but guesstimates. And I would think that you would want to look at the worst case scenario, that has been modeled in the South African context, precisely because of the weak position we were in, when we entered the pandemic.
We're going to speak a lot. We're going to speak a lot about that, Busi. But I had a note here. Love Busi Mavuso's passion. Herman Funk, Bridget Archer, Marlon Burgess, Beulah Tambadu, Richard Cherry. I see all of you. We're joined by 498 people. Very welcome. Looking forward to your questions as well. Dr. Petrus de Kock, do you want to take us through why national brand leadership even matters in a time like this?
No, I think our colleague laid out a lot of the context, of some of the issues that we are dealing with. I think I'll also go to your question you asked originally, in terms of the global leadership picture we are seeing. It's very clear this is a leadership by case. Each nation is confronted in its own way with this. In terms of lockdown, non-lockdown, how do you open an economy? It's all driven by how it manifests in your society. But I think the interesting dynamic here that I think we must also keep in mind, isn't it ironic that we have this global pandemic health crisis breaking out in a period of a few years? If you look back now at things like Brexit, if you look at trade war dynamics at the global stage, where leaders take positions of isolationism, reactionary policies, counter global trade, etc. Now we have this global health pandemic that's actually forcing the world economy to disintegrate. You understand what I mean?
Yes.
So when we talk about South Africa's recovery, when we talk about these issues on the table, let's also then pay attention to what's happening on the global stage, because our recovery as an economy has tremendous opportunities as well. Yes, we have been taking a hammering for quite a few years. The data is out there. We've seen the recessions. We've seen the dynamics in the economy. However, I do think if you listen to what the President and the Minister of Finance have been saying in the, say, 21 April, 24 April, some of those specific statements, I think the sentiment that's coming through is, here's our economic policy response, but more important than that is the engagement now with that policy response in an environment where we need new collaborations. We need new ways of engaging with these challenges as a society and an economy. And I think it will challenge all of us. And I think we'll have to be honest about that as leaders in society, as leaders in communities, as leaders in organizations. And I think that's the theme of our conversation today, is leadership there. Leadership in a time of economic crisis, leadership in a time of global crisis. And I think that's, if we are being honest, that's really what one of the dimensions of the discussion should be. It's just
okay, well, let's go to that. Roger Arnser has a great question. What is your honest perspective on the gap between the leadership we need in South Africa and the quality of the leadership we currently have? I'll just tie it in with a whole lot of questions I'm seeing coming up. And it strikes me that in the first part of the lockdown, we had enormous consensus, unity, and solidarity. Those were our governing values, if you like, and themes emerging. But now that seems to be fraying. And a lot of that fraying has to do with failures in the state. Many questions here about SASSA, for example, what people are reading about the failures of the grant payment system. So we might have overarching great practices, a lot of money being put aside. 500 billion is really a best practice relief package in a country that doesn't have a lot of money. Maybe to the question from Roger, I think it was. Is there a leadership gap here?
There definitely is. There definitely is. And I think, maybe allow me to just go a step back to say that I have no doubt in my mind that South Africa is what it is because our leaders are not what they ought to be. We are entering this pandemic, in a fractured democracy and in a fractured society. I read with interest, I think about probably when the lockdown started, Ferial, I think this was a WhatsApp from some Indian doctor who was saying that everything that we've been requested to observe, to ward off the virus seems to only be available or accessible, to the affluent in our society, because if we are being told to social distance, it assumes that you actually have a house big enough to can do that, knowing very well that the reality in this country is that a lot of our people are literally living on top of each other. If you are being asked that you have to continuously wash your hands, it assumes that you have running water, and yet a lot of our people don't. If you're being asked that you have to constantly sanitize your hands, it assumes that you've got the money to buy the sanitizer. And yet we are sitting with a 30% unemployment, and with the highest inequality in the world. If we are being told to stay at home, it assumes that you have the luxury to do so. And we know that a lot of our people literally live hand to mouth. They actually have to go out in the morning, and try and get whatever income that they get and actually spend that for the day. And so it goes from day to day to day. So for me, that is a failure in leadership. 25 years into democracy, Ferial, we shouldn't be sitting as one of the most unequal societies in the world. I think if our government was very clear from an economic policy perspective, if we had actually properly defined the problem statement when we entered this democracy in 1994 in terms of what it is that we're trying to solve for, our people shouldn't be confronted with some of the harsh realities that they are actually confronted with at the moment. We saw how a lot of people were actually, running to buy groceries, before the lockdown period, and we know that that was only people like you and I who could actually afford to do so. We are sitting at the moment, in a country where, a lot of people are actually starving, because of the loss of income. We are sitting in an environment where a lot of SMMEs are saying that we don't know if we are going to be in a position to hit the restart button after the lockdown is over, because from a policy perspective, we have not enabled the SMMEs to be able to have access to markets. Because if you speak to a lot of SMMEs, they will tell you that our biggest problem is not access to finance, it's rather access to, markets. We are still sitting in a country where, the economy is characterized mainly by oligopolies, where you have 3-4 big players in the industry, and where there is a lot of rigidity in as far as regulation is concerned, for SMMEs to actually try and enter, that market. So we've been talking about the structural reforms that needed to be put in this country. And the big one we're talking to as business, was the ease of doing business, so that you can allow for there to be a lot of players in the market, because by having a lot of players in the market, then you actually increase competition. And if you're increasing competition, you're forcing efficiencies, from organizations like ESCOM, for instance.
Can I ask you can I just bring you a question in there from Ms. Rani? He's saying, is this an opportunity for a reset? I mean, can we use this moment to make a more equal economy, one that excludes fewer South Africans? For either of you to take that question.
I think, Ferial, before we started, we had a quick chat, and I mentioned, actually in preparation for this session, I asked myself, who can I go and look at for maybe a bit of a different perspective on some of these challenges that we have. And I remember I have a collection of essays by Albert Einstein, and I'm just going to read you 2 sentences, maybe from a quick snippet from one of his essays. And this is Einstein. The 20th century and the world we know today wouldn't be what it is if it wasn't for what that man brought through in his science and his discoveries. So later in his life, he wrote a lot of essays reflecting on issues of society, science, etc. And this is on the economy. He says, everything is dominated by the cult of efficiency and of success, and not by the value of things and men in relation to the moral ends of human society. That's one sentence from Einstein. What does it mean? It means we know we live in a world where we privilege profit over human value. We know that. There's no doubt about that. Philosophies, political traditions, liberation struggles, you name it, in the history of the last 300 years of this planet were defined by those moments of humans striving for a better world, for equality, for equal opportunity. You understand what I mean? We know that history of the world. But now, I think, given the realities that we are facing, not just as a South African society and as a South African SMME, but as a humanity, we have a moment here where we have to seriously ask the question, our modus operandi in terms of how we accumulate wealth, how we distribute wealth in a society and resources, yes, those are constant debates in our society. And maybe I can make a comment from a brand South Africa point of view, how we've managed a lot of these issues over time. There's one objective, which is the collective of South Africa, which we need to understand. How do we grow, protect, preserve, and expand that brand, that totality of the nation? And all of that happens in the context of a lot of disagreement and a lot of very painful history as well. We must acknowledge that. But this moment that we have here now, I think, is also an opening to ask new questions. Now, for example, maybe it's very relevant to say, maybe, for example, and I'm just throwing it out there as a thought, our land reform project in this country, now is the best time for that, because we need food security. Global supply chains are being wrecked around the planet because of COVID and the global outfall. You understand what I mean? Now, where's the creativity on agriculture, new partnerships, building new rural as well as urban metro economies around new agriculture? You understand what I mean? I think, yes, there's a lot of criticism and there's a lot of punches we can put out there. But this crisis can also force us now to say, let's forget about all the fancy accumulation of numbers. Let's survive as human beings. Let's work together. And if we make profit at the same time, brilliant. You understand what I mean? I think it's just some thoughts actually inspired by Einstein.
Well, I really hope that those thoughts by Einstein are you feeding them into your political seniors. Busi, I wonder if you, and I'm not to take away confidence, but you sit in the in many big meetings where these decisions are taken. Outside, it can sometimes feel questioned from one of the people with us today that government too often resorts to the big stick rather than to persuasion or care, which were the initial values. When you sit there, is there a deep care for people in those meetings when these big decisions are taken about whether it's the right time to start easing lockdown now or where it is? Eh?
Ferial, that definitely is. And I think the frustration of business at the moment with the rigidity, of the easing of the lockdown regulations, I think, it's precisely because of that carefulness, for government to say that we don't want to actually allow people to go out there, very quickly, and end up with a whole lot of people infected, and who are therefore going to not be able to fend for their families, when they are sick anyway. So I think there is that carefulness, but I think the frustration is that we're going to have to be able to balance things, but I guess, to directly answer your question, the biggest concern, and what this government has been trying to protect during this COVID-19 is definitely the health of our people. So the discussion we are having at the moment is the lives versus livelihood, or is it lives versus lives, and you could see that they continue to tread, very carefully to a fault, in my view, because then,
are you saying, Busi, that we should start unlocking more parts of the economy more quickly because we really have a hunger crisis now, and obviously we're going to have an even worse jobs crisis? Is that your view?
Precisely. So it's the lives versus livelihoods, because I guess, either way, people are either going to die of hunger, or people are going to die because of the virus. But we're going to have to actually straddle a careful balance to say, at what point do we actually, make a decision so that we don't end up sitting with a collapsed economy, either way, because either way you lose. So I think there's going to have to be that awareness, that we're actually dealing with a very delicate and careful situation, and we're actually going to have to be very careful in terms of how we proceed, in terms of where we are at the moment.
Thank you. And Petrus, you've been doing some interesting research surveys. We read maybe on Twitter, which is a representation of very little actually, but what are South Africans feeling? Are their views changing as we go into 50 days almost?
We have a monthly survey that we run, and in April, the first batch, we included that was the first month then of the big lockdown measure. So we'll be repeating it in May, but the next round is only running, I think, next week. So towards the end of the month, we'll have updated data. But in April, what we saw is that a good 60% of the respondents were in support of measures taken by government. Understanding, firstly, here we have a major health crisis coming our way, accepting and appreciating government's efforts, so a good healthy 60% of people supporting government interventions. But now we've gone through the month of April, I think, as one of you pointed out earlier, which is rightfully so. It's becoming a long period of time now. And yes, there's a lot of economic pressure, and I think also a lot of uncertainty coming through. Levels of lockdown, etc. I think all of us are trying to wrap our heads around that. But I think ultimately the big thrust in terms of the public understanding is we appreciate it, we accept it for what it is, but there is also a high level of concern, about personal and family circumstance. That's exactly the economic point. That's confirmed by this data, that South Africans in general are very concerned about income and the future. What is the future outlook? But then, interestingly enough, we also then included a question, which is something, if I can make a quick story about it. You remember, one of you referred to this. In the run-up to this, I think February, March, the president was extremely busy meeting with different sectors of society, religious leaders, political leaders, business, etc., etc., to the point where ultimately we went into lockdown, etc. Now, that is an interesting model of engagement that the president had with society. Now, here's something that we already commented on then. That's a lesson we must now take as we go forward as a society into economic recovery, as well as, the long-term picture of how do we move forward as a society. Because look, life as it was before we went into lockdown won't return easily and quickly in the form of big events, people together. You understand what I mean? There's going to be a
if you were to put on a look, how long do you think it's going to take? And probably there will be no.
I can't comment on normal. The point that I want to be making, is that yes, things have changed quite fundamentally, and in the bigger scheme of things, it will be new collaboration for the economic recovery, new ways of thinking about how do we, within certain limitations, engage with that reality. And I think also there's a lot of openness at this stage, from organizations like ourselves, Brand South Africa and Ferial. I actually wanted to say that thanks for hosting this session, because this also helps us to kind of ventilate ideas, get feedback, get the input from a business perspective, because ultimately all of the efforts we need to launch from here onwards need to understand, where are people at, where are we being frustrated, and how do we make it easier for all of us. I think the president said it in the early days of this, where he said that this is uncharted territory. None of us have been here. We've never invoked the National Disaster Act. We've never deployed more than 70,000 SANDF into our streets, into our nation. You understand what I mean? So all of us must learn from this. I think most importantly, as a nation, core principle is the constitutional nature of our democracy. If we keep that healthy, all of the efforts we take as business, as society, and government, if all of it is still guided by our commitment to that core value of that society, I think then we're already winning. You understand what I mean? Because yes, there's going to be challenges, but the leadership is going to need to come from that core commitment to, yes, it may be disastrous, but we need to get through this. And I think that's what the president has been saying very clearly.
So a lot of people on our call, Busi, are saying, please, I just don't want to have any more problems. Give me some solutions. Are you seeing any bright sparks, either of you, in innovation sectors which are not thriving, but certainly where with a small put they could? Education. I've been watching specifically how suddenly we are getting water to people who did not have water for years, temporary housing to people living in shacks, and they don't look too bad if you look at the photographs that the Minister Lindiwe Sisulu has been putting up. But do you think we can, Busi, move faster, and where are you seeing some solutions coming to, or is that just kind of a fool's paradise to talk solutions yet? Huh?
Yeah. So I think that definitely is an opportunity to actually start changing things around permanently. You definitely have seen a much more better social compacting, that has happened, I think, over this period. I think there is a better alignment in terms of all of us as social partners, because we are very clear what we are trying to solve for. We are very clear what the direction and the goal is, and you're seeing all of us moving towards that direction. And I think there's been a lot of opportunity, I think, that has been opened up. You're seeing a lot of companies, for instance, you have a Distel, which is currently, manufacturing sanitizers, because alcohol sales have been suspended. You're seeing a lot of small businesses that are actually coming up, and producing masks, that are required on the large scale, and you're seeing a lot of flexibility, where we have had to suspend certain regulation to allow for certain players in an industry to actually, work together. Like we saw with the suspension of, the competition bill, to allow the banks to work together and whatever the cases. So if we actually take that, and I think Kock perfectly puts it to say that we are never going to go back to the South Africa that we had, 6 weeks ago before we entered the lockdown. So if we can actually take that as a template and as a base of how we actually move forward as a country, if we can actually apply the same agency, if we can actually apply the same flexibility, if we can actually apply the same innovation, the quick decision making that we actually were able to do in the past 6 weeks, then there is nothing stopping us. The communities, by the way, that have been delivered water to have been sitting probably without water for the past 25 years. So it's something
I think so for many of them.
For whatever reason, we just haven't done it, because our priorities were not where we were supposed to be. So I'm hoping that this allows us to turn the corner. This allows us to actually start engaging with things from a totally different lens, to actually, start putting, and this has actually been precipitated by the fact that we have chosen to elevate, the livelihoods of South Africans above all else. We have actually chosen to look at the stakeholder capitalism, versus the shareholder capitalism. We have made a decision as a country that every life matters, and we are going to do everything that we can, irrespective of which corner or constituency we come from, to ensure that we actually protect that. And I think it would actually definitely be a great template and formula going forward if we were to just keep on at it, at this trajectory. But I'm worried that it doesn't look like that is going to be the case. But I guess that's a different conversation.
So many questions here, and I thought I might get your thoughts on them, although I know you're not directly responsible, is lots of things don't work. So there'll be a fabulous announcement about small business relief or a basic income grant to those who are not on other grants. And somebody here says, I've been trying forever and the WhatsApp number is not functioning. What about that gap, Dr. de Kock? Can you share with us? Has this come up in surveys as well?
No, look, we do see, and we have quite a bit of data, because look, let me put it this way. We look at the broader reputation profile of the nation, and one of that elements is governance, which speakly, and that is underpinned by government service and perception, ultimately, of the South African public of that. And yes, there are particular areas of service where South Africans have very little trust in particular types of services. Like Eskom has dropped dramatically over the years. That's no surprise. If you look at issues like around your postal services, for example, trust in that has dropped dramatically. So a lot of your public interfacing services like that are not very well trusted. So we know that. Now, a few thoughts on this. I think the crisis has pointed to certain weaknesses also in the system, but also I think some of those are not a surprise. We do know that over time, the SASSA system has been under strain for particular reasons, either for the magnitude of the system, because remember, we're covering millions and millions of people on a monthly basis across this country. So now on top of this, you have this crisis, which puts an extra load with extra additional grants coming through, to support society. So I don't think it's an excuse. I think the system is extremely loaded and strained in certain areas. But I think as we go into this, those issues are identified and addressed. I think in as much as there has been challenges like that, I think there are also examples in the last month where we can go and we can say, look, that problem was identified there was a system failure, but there was an intervention. There was a fix ultimately coming through. So I think it's also, as a lot of the ministers have also been saying, is that we do have to learn as we go on. We can't assume we've got perfect systems here. We don't. But where they do break at those critical points, we need to understand why and how do we intervene. And I think maybe going back to the earlier part of the discussion, yes, there's a lot of state system interventions that necessary: water, sanitation, etc., etc., etc. And I think with the rebuilding effort, if one calls it that, or the recovery effort, and I think there's been comments made like that, not just in the business community, but by policymakers as well, in the recent times, that maybe now is the time we need to look at what is our hygiene situation in the country. Where are the teams of people working on not just constructing, but reconstructing infrastructure that's necessary? You understand what I mean? So we need to think nuts and bolts recovery, and we need to think very big ticket stuff. And Ferial, just before I forget, just two comments. Earlier question you had on ideas for recovery. Where are those pockets?
Yeah.
Now let's think manufacturing.
What's our Marshall Plan?
Yes. Now this is just two quick examples. It's not totally random, but I'll give you a bit of context. Let's look at manufacturing in South Africa. Our profile of manufacturing exports, that just about 50%, nearly 50% of our exports go into the Pan-African market. First point. Secondly, EY, Ernst & Young, every year they do the Africa Attractiveness Survey, where South Africa is consistently about fifth to some years third largest source of foreign direct investment in the whole African economy.
Yes.
Which means we've got a tremendous footprint as South Africa in public as well as private enterprise on this continent. Now, our positioning on the African continent is critical to our economic survival. And we've got two brilliant things counting for us this year. Firstly, the Continental Free Trade Area is operationalized with a South African as its first Secretary General, who will be based in Ghana. And secondly, the President is chair of the African Union. So for our recovery strategy in this year, we've got tremendous opportunities to leverage what we have already in our economic base, to look at how do we link the internal economic recovery with opportunities within the region and in the global market. Because, as we indicated earlier, there are real further threats to the regime of global free trade. A month ago or so, and I'm just giving you an example, a month ago or so, there was some talk happening in the US, for example, that they must pay for the repatriation of American companies from China to the US. And that debate is growing. It's now growing legs in certain circles. To illustrate, we may be dealing with the next wave on top of COVID. We may be dealing with the next wave of global trade war dynamics going up. So South Africa's position in the African continent is then critical for us to consider how do we deal with our national crisis and how does our response link to a continental intervention that I think can ultimately save a lot of African countries in the next decade.
Well, then I guess we've got to start trading again. So, Busi, question from Calvin Montgomery here. Social Compact Society says the premise is the legality and the rationality of the lockdown regulations. It's presumptuous in the highest degree to assume that there's agreement or consensus on that. Are you getting a lot of these kinds of questions at the BLSA, at BUSA, at the BMF, all your different forums where people questioning continuous strict lockdown of a large part of the economy?
Absolutely. I think we are all in agreement that there's going to have to be a rapid release of the lockdown, and I think the way in which government has chosen to come to the levels and how they're actually going to phase in the easing of the economy or the opening up of the economy, definitely, a lot of the input that we gave as business was not taken into account. We don't understand the rationale and the thinking behind it. And I suspect that it is a case of they decided when they locked down the economy that they were actually going to exclude everything. And now they are trying to see how do we stitch everything, together and bring back certain parts of the economy versus maybe leaving everything and saying, what is it that we're actually going to exclude? Because then if you do it that way, so versus an inward out, it was supposed to be an inward out, versus an outward in, point of view.
So who should make that decision, Ms. Mavuso? Should it be government or should it be business, or should there be that concertina of a genuine social compact? Because last week I feel like you guys were only given a day to comment on the lockdown.
Absolutely. And I think that is what the issue is, to say that we don't know what informs, the current phasing in of economic activity. We don't know what the levels, are informed by. We don't know who has been consulted and whose views have been taken into account in terms of how we are choosing to open up the economy. We don't know if we are seeing the same things in as far as the economic crisis that is actually in front of us. We don't know if we see the same disaster, from the economy that we are actually facing and the job losses, that we're actually going to experience as a result of the lockdown. And if business is therefore responsible for the economic activity in the country, I would have thought that our views would have been taken into account. If you look, for instance, at the ban of cigarettes and the ban of alcohol, you just have to look at that and say that if the SARS commissioner is saying that we have lost 1.5 billion, as a result, as a direct result, of the loss of excise duties. Why would that not be taken into account? If the finance minister is saying that it doesn't make sense for us to continue, banning the sale of cigarettes, why would his counterparts in government not take that into account? And you actually have to look and say, how does it make sense that retail outlets are open, but there's things that you still can't buy, within those retail outlets?
I must say, I found it very odd when I went to Pick n Pay at the weekend, and everything was open except maybe 3 arbitrary shelves with red tape over it. It really felt like diktat and not sensible.
Precisely, so I think we are looking at it and we're saying that there probably hasn't been, this definitely was not evidence-based. There were no expert presentations that were taken into account. But more importantly, because we know that we don't have that best case scenario that we can look at, or best practice that we can look at least government or a business should have actually been consulted extensively in terms of how we think, the lockdown should actually be eased.
Thank you very much. So, Petrus, if I may, a lacquer question here. How will Brand SA recover from the setback? The UN has noted our country for the heavy-handedness of the SA NDF and police in the townships. But I wonder if that's completely fair, Kay Lockwood, because on the other hand, the WHO has praised us to the moon and back for the health response. So do you think, Petrus, that how we are regarded globally and continentally is actually a little bit more mixed than that? Or what's your research showing you?
I think there's a very nuanced picture out there in terms of South Africa. Particularly, I think, as you say, there was the World Health Organization very clearly acknowledging the South African approach, the methodologies, deployed by government, not just a lockdown measure, but also in your physical deployment of tracer teams, etc., etc. Just to deploy a tracer team in the country to track, potential infection, that's an intensive job. I think there's a lot of capability that's been acknowledged in our system, in the health system, etc., and being recognized internationally. Then you get to the leadership, where President Ramaphosa, by name, we've picked it up in some of our monitoring, would be mentioned, as an example of a leader, proactive, very strong personal approach, to engaging with the citizenry, engaging with the public, and being as transparent as possible, with sharing of that information. And look, we see on the other side of the Atlantic, and we don't even have to name names, the controversies around leadership and how a personal attitude of a leader and just the words you use can actually have a tremendous impact, not just on your nation's psyche, but on the global opinion of your country. So I think President Ramaphosa and the team around him that supports him have been doing tremendous work. And I think maybe to the point earlier, yes, there's a lot of criticism that we are in a very difficult period now as we go into the staggered. The whole idea around the levels, if I understand it correctly, is exactly to try and enable what we're talking about, to open up business activity, to enable certain forms of activity. But really, I think we will need interaction. We will need tremendous interaction.
I don't think you can have someone sitting in an office of the DTI making those decisions, and it felt like that. I don't mean to be rude, sorry. So Nomvula Dlamini sharing some nice stories. There's small businesses at the Woodstock Exchange doing interesting things. Rural communities in the Eastern Cape harvesting crops weekly. My nephew's company is doing fantastically during these trying times. Nice to hear. From Renee Hartzleff, Busi, please can we open up tourism for local trade? We're responsible and larger job creators than mining and agriculture. And we're an essential service that's ignored. Are you getting quite a bit of that from different sectors?
Absolutely. So I think there is that view that we're going to have to prioritize the interventions that are actually going to have the highest reforms, number one. And we're definitely going to have to prioritize the sectors that have got the highest vulnerability to job losses. So where I think there'll be more people that are laid off as a result of this, and where there are most people employed, there's going to have to be priority in as far as that is concerned. I don't know about tourism per se, because I think if the entire world is locked down, people are not traveling anyway. And I think you have this, small issue, of consumer confidence. Even if people have got the means to can travel and to actually start being up and about, but because of the fact that our confidence has been shattered as consumers at the moment, we are playing a wait and see game, and if we're going to be traveling to outside countries or to outside provinces, you're actually saying, I'd rather wait until, we know what's happening, when as far as the eradication of the pandemic is concerned. But I think definitely, tourism as an industry that has got the potential to can actually employ a lot of people, alongside with similar industries, is definitely going to have to be prioritized when we get to phase 3, of the interventions that we're putting in place to actually turn our economy around.
Absolutely. From Jen's turn, stay there, please. Busi, is what do we get from Europe, the US, Asia that's not available here? Do we need to look that far abroad? So I guess this is an import substitution and local manufacturing and beneficiation story. Do you think that this is a moment of opportunity, given that you've seen production lines being created from everything from ventilators to masks? Do you think there's such a moment now?
I think this presents that opportunity, and I think I spoke to earlier on to say that you saw how a lot of companies have actually been innovative, and actually doing and producing things that they actually haven't done before. A lot of SMMEs have come up during this time in terms of, the production of PPE, and, currently as the Solidarity Fund, we are actually purchasing from them. So I guess this probably maybe presents us an opportunity to say that what is it, and we definitely can't be self-sufficient as a country, but what is it that we can actually do internally? But I think the question is not just of responding to the crisis, it is a bigger question of, by ensuring that we innovate, then that is how you secure more jobs. Because by actually, allowing outside players, to actually do what it is that you can do internally, you are actually giving away your opportunity to can create jobs in a country where, we have more people that are unemployed than those that are employed in all the provinces except Gauteng and the Western Cape. We definitely have to be engaging with these things, a bit more differently. And especially because we are going to be losing more jobs, if we maintain the status quo. We saw Edcon has already announced business rescue. We saw ComAir has already announced business rescue. A lot of SMMEs are saying we don't know if we'll be able to open up the economy. So I think it therefore gives us an opportunity to say, what is it, in our supply value chain that can actually be done domestically? Do we have to be as dependent as we are to the international community? And my view is that the answer is no. There are things that definitely can be done internally, and this allows us an opportunity to actually
we're really seeing that moment now. Petrus, many questions here, and maybe for both of you, from small business owners saying, gosh, the red tape is still strangling for anything. If you want to get relief, you can register a business, or I think that's improved. Compensation front, UIF, SARS, there's still too much. So Brand SA has done a lot of work around this. Is that something that still comes up quite often?
Yes, you know what, maybe it's an opportunity to just talk a bit of, we get occupied now by COVID, but we must also remember from when, I think it was actually President Ramaphosa's very first State of the Nation address, 2018, before the election, I think that very first one, he already stated that ease of doing business is one of his key priorities of this administration, the 6th administration. And you know what, there's been a lot of activity. In the practical realm, if you look at the DTI Invest SA infrastructure of the Department of Trade and Industry, there's been a team from the World Bank working with the DTI for quite a number of months, if not more than a year now, looking at the South Africa's business infrastructure, ease of doing business profile. There we had the launch of the Biz Portal. I'm not exactly sure about status and all the functionalities of it at this moment, but we have definitely progressed in terms of a lot of the issues that we were discussing 2 years ago, like number of days to start a business. A lot of those procedural things have been made electronic, which is transparent. There's no funny business around it. So I think we've made not the big steps we want to. And I think also when you look at some of the comments of Minister Mboweni in the recent weeks, when he talks about the economic policy position of South Africa at this point in time, the ease of doing business issue is implied, I think, in a lot of the stuff that the president and the minister talks about, because when the minister speaks, he would say, look, the structural reform agenda as we recover and rebuild this economy going forward is not a luxury item, It's something we have to engage with. And yes, of course, there's going to be some very difficult decisions on that road. But I think it's like a point we made earlier in our discussion. I think in world historical terms, whether we want it or not, we're at that kind of inflection moment, where, yes, a lot of good decisions can be made, but I think a lot of postponed or delayed things can also cause a tremendous amount of damage in the long term. So I think we've got some tough choices to make, but I think we've got a lot in our favor as a country to make those choices.
Thank you. So from Joe Samuels, Busi, a question that relates to your previous point. So shouldn't government be the standard setting measure and then leave it up to all the sectors to put the mechanisms in place? So you put the onus on the sectoral responses rather than trying to do everything to determine whether I have to buy shorts or long trousers. Is that a possibility at all?
And I think that is the approach that we actually should have adopted, because I think sectors are probably in a better position to actually say, what is it that we can do during this period and what it is that we can't do. But in so doing as well, you put the onus on business to say that, the health protocols are going to have to be observed, and it is your responsibility to ensure that you protect your customers and you protect your staff members. And then instead of saying that across the board, only 30% of people can go back to work. For some industries, 30% is actually, it doesn't make sense, because then they run big machines and big furnaces, and the utilization of that at only 30% capacity doesn't just make financial sense. You're actually speeding the process of those businesses going out of business, because then the unit cost of production is going up, because then they are running these big machines at only a fraction of the capacity. So I think it could have been better if we were allowed more leeway to say that, what do you think you can do, and what responsibility comes with that, and are you willing to therefore ensure that you actually take over that responsibility, instead of everything being decided by government? Because let's agree, we don't have a capable state at the moment, and government cannot know all the intricacies of all the sectors, and it's okay, it's fine. They don't have to know all the intricacies of all the sectors. That's why you've got business and you've got industry, experts who can actually come in and say, this is what we think is actually going to work, and maybe play the role of final arbiter to say that, does this plan make sense, and will it actually grant the protection that I actually aim to achieve of the majority of the citizens of this country, rather than actually, coming up with this rules-based approach versus a risk-based approach.
That's very clear. And I'm going to read you a nice comment from Blake Faulkner. I went to Game at the weekend to purchase a gazebo in order to cover an outside washstand in order to comply with the regulations to prepare our factory, but I was unable to purchase that because it wasn't on the list of allowed products to be sold. So on the one hand, Game's compliant, but it's making it difficult for him to comply, which is precisely your point about where the expertise should lie. And should it be light touch regulation or heavy regulation? Lots of people on our chat saying, too much government, too much of a strong fist approach, when what you need perhaps is greater persuasion. Busi, last question, Nav, one for Petrus as well. Many people are saying we want to see the president more here. We want him to speak to us more. What do you think's behind such a call, and how busy is he? I mean, you're someone who has him on speed dial, I think.
No, I don't actually, but yeah. So I think we're probably maybe going to have to give our president a little bit of leeway, I think, when it comes to what we're currently facing, as a country. I think we must also commend him for having done his best, in the West situation, in an unprecedented situation, in an uncharted territory. He did what was best for the country, and I think he did a sterling job. So I think he can actually just give the framework of how things need to be done and allow his ministers to actually deal with the details, because he can't be, everything. I remember one of the conversations we probably had, was it a week back or something like that, at NetLec, chaired by the president, where he was saying, I just got off the phone with President Jinping, of China, to say that, can you ensure that all the production of ventilators that you're actually going to be producing from now on, or for the next 2 weeks or whatever the case is, if they can come to South Africa, and apparently they were actually prioritized for the US. And I thought, but it shouldn't be the president who's making those calls, right? I think there are more critical things that should actually be dealing with. I'm sure our health minister is more than capable to actually secure PPE and masks and whatever the case is. So I think he's being pulled in all different directions at the moment. But I don't think that we can actually blame him for not showing up during this period. I think just in the 6 weeks, I think he has addressed the nation 3 times or something like that, where he was actually trying to give people hope, trying to actually be as transparent as possible in terms of what is currently in the headspace of government. And I think he has definitely done the same in terms of engaging with all of us as social partners, business in particular, to take us into his confidence, to say that this is, some of the things that I'm struggling with. What do you think? But then it therefore becomes a useless exercise when it does that, and then the ministers don't follow on in terms of taking on our advice. But hey, I think he's really doing the best in the most difficult situation. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Petrus, do you have a final thought? I didn't realize how quickly time had romped. People are quite nervous, though. Of a long-term lockdown, for example.
Look, I think I can't comment about long-term lockdowns, but I think what the reality we have to face, just for example, on the tourism question we had earlier, we must face the reality, that in markets around the world, this virus is going to manifest over time. Yes, we're all dealing with an initial breakout now, but you don't know what's going to happen the next flu season on another part of the planet, etc. So when it comes to certain things, there's a lot of uncertainty out there. And I think all of us must just kind of stay calm and ask ourselves, how can we be rational? How can we be realistic in our engagements with our society, with our families, with our people that we deal with? And I think in terms of the South African context, I do think what the president and the team has been doing has been tremendous in trying to be as transparent as possible. But I think to the business conversation on specific regulations, I think all of us have bumped into that, be it in Pick and Pay or Game or wherever, some strange things you start wondering why. But I do think we just need to, we democratic society, let's be open, let's give the feedback, let's use BLSA, let's use NetLag, let's use the platforms that we have. We can be diplomatic about it. We don't always need to fight about it. I do think we've got a lot of platforms where there's a lot of openness to say, look, man, we are facing these kind of issues. Let's find another way of dealing with it, because we're really going to have to adjust things quite dramatically as we go on still. So,
thank you both for your frankness, for sharing with us. Thank you for being with us, people. Renee, I hear you that tourism isn't only international. Yes, it can be local. And I don't think, as somebody expressed a fear, that there's going to be a forever lockdown. I think that you would have to have citizen buy-in for any further steps we take. Thank you for your frankness and also your expertise, Mavuso, CEO of BLSA, Petrus de Kock, the GM for Research at Brand SA. Really value your time. Have a good day. Thank you to Brand SA for sponsoring the webinar.
Thank you.